tribute to Joe Diorio. It's the 20th anniversary of the release of The Color of Sound, our record together, and it was Joe's last recording. And I'm really pleased to have my special guest today, the great Steve Lynch. Hey, Steve, thanks for coming today.
Hey, David, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure being here.
Oh, man, it's great. We've been talking for a while about doing this, or having some kind of conversation, and it just seemed to fit with the anniversary of the record and Joe's passing that we could do this. So I'm really, really pleased that you're here. I know you have a new book, which I want to ask about, because I've been reading some. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but what I've read is great. So there it is.
Right there.
Cool. So what I want to talk about to get started with is when you went to GIT, what year?
It was 78.
So what were they already in the Wax Museum building by that time?
It was before that. It was 58 Hollywood Boulevard. It was right next to Hollywood Boulevard and the Hollywood Freeway on one side.
Oh, okay. So they had moved out of the Sunset Gower Studios then by that time.
Exactly. It was the first year that was in the new building.
Okay.
Itself was only maybe a year old.
Yeah, I think
it was some of the curriculum when I was attending it. You know, so we're still in its beginning stages, but man, what a great time. What year did you go?
I started in March of 1980.
1980. Okay, so yeah, it was March of 1978. So
yes, they had moved to the Wax Museum building above whatever that was, the second floor on Hollywood and Highland. I remember I was in Pat Hicks' office when he was making that deal.
Oh, was
he was,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, he said, I'm in the midst of trying to buy this old Max Factor building and move the school over there because we're running out of space. So when you were there, because I know you told me the story on the phone about how you wound up there. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about your connection with Don Mock.
Oh, my connection with Don Mock, he was my teacher in Seattle. And that's where I'm from. That's where I grew up. And anyway, somebody referred him to me, and I knew of him because he was like the number one guy I could see in Seattle. He was selling out every venue that he played, and it was always standing room only. I mean, the guy was just phenomenal. He had a huge name up there, and so I got in. I was put on a waiting list, but then I got in to start taking lessons from him. And at this point, I was already playing professionally. I started playing, really seriously in 1970, but then I started playing professionally in 1973. And so, when I started taking lessons from him, he got me into all the theory and everything, which I didn't know before. I'd only been playing by ear up to that point. And so then I was out doing some more shows again, so I had to take some time off. We were always touring up there. And so what I did was at this hotel in Montana, I called up to see if I could get in for set up some more lessons for when I came back into town. And they said in West Seattle Music, they said, well, Don's not here anymore. And what? And he said, the owner said, no, Don moved down to Hollywood. They're starting up a new guitar school there. And I went, guitar school? My eyes lit up. And I just,
right.
God, that's like the perfect thing in the world, And so I actually called up, the information down there because West Seattle didn't have the number down there. And I got it 213-462-1384. I think that was it. 212. But anyway, so I memorized it, actually, and this was from way back in 1977. Mm-hmm. And I actually got Don on the phone. And I was one of Don's favorites because I always really practiced everything he gave me and had it memorized every time I went back in for a lesson. And so he loved that. And so anyway, so I got him on the phone and he said, Steve, quit your band, sell your gear, and get your ass down here. And 3 months later, I was there. So that was it. And that was like the best decision I ever made, was to go down there. And because it was the level of professionalism. You come from all these different places in the U.S. or worldwide at that point, and still today. But, this is a real professional learning environment.
Yeah.
And it wasn't only the teachers that you learned from, as you well know, it was the students too.
Absolutely.
All over, and they have a different perspective on how to approach the instrument. And so it was absolutely the best thing ever was going to that school, and still being in touch, of some of my classmates. It was just really a great experience.
Yeah. Well, it was a vocational school, which at that time, it was probably the only one like that. Because, I mean, there was a guitar program in Miami and Berkeley, but to have a school dedicated to just guitar and bass.
Yeah, when I was going there, they didn't even have the bass school yet.
Oh, okay. So just guitar
It
players.
was just guitar, and then I think about halfway through the year, they started BIT. And then they had, all these other ones, TIT.
Right.
I think they got to VIT, and that's when they, for the Vocal Institute, and that's when I think they changed it over to
MI. Yeah. So let's talk about Joe Diorio, because Joe is our connection. So when did you meet Joe the first time?
Well, it was basically on the first day I attended, which was, I believe, March 20th, 1978. And Joe was in the hall, and I met him, and he gave me this crazy look, and Joe, his sense of humor and everything. Well, he immediately fell in love with my tight-fitting leather coat, He said, hey, he knew my name, and so he said, can I try that on? Because Joe's a big fella.
He's a big guy.
I said, sure, Joe. And he couldn't even get one arm into the sleeve because it was a really tight-fitting jacket, and I weighed all of 130 pounds at the time. And so he tried it, and we all of us started laughing. It was just fun to tell. And I used to corner him in the hallways all the time, and said, Joe, what's that thing that you were playing, in the classroom, and I'd kind of pick his brain all the time. And so he started showing me these different approaches to interval skips, intervallic designs, like the name of this skill. And so I started incorporating that, even with octaves and stuff. And with rock and roll, you kind of have to curtail it down to, you got to stick with the pentatonics and
right.
The minor and major scales and stuff like that. But I figured out as much as I could. And in fact, years later, there's one lick in the beginning of intervallic designs that I just fell in love with.
Yeah.
And so I use that lick and turn up the radio. It's like halfway through the solo, right before the double-handed hammer part that I do in there, and I use that exact lick.
I was down in St. Louis this weekend with my wife Lori to see Alex Skolnick. And Alex and I did a podcast together just about after Joe had passed. And I mentioned to him that you told me that, and now it's like, I used one of those too in a Testament solo. So, that Joe's legacy has gone far beyond, the jazz world. And so, the thing about Joe is that Joe was so open to, sharing his concept of what he was exploring himself, and he didn't really care about whether you could play giant steps or you were playing the blues. He wanted to impart something that would give you a perspective that was way beyond what you would get from somebody else. And I mean, did you have a chance to actually sit with Joe, and did you ever play with Joe at that time? Did you ever?
We just messed around, just like in a teaching kind of atmosphere, just not jamming really.
Right.
I was still learning the ropes when I was going there, so. And then once I graduated, I was pretty much off and gone. I was playing in different bands, and I was doing studio work and everything. And then next thing you know, in late '83, what became Autograph started to form. So.
Well, you were legendary when I started the school, because in the orientation, I think it was Becky Hicks. She talked about you. She talked about you that you'd always be in the practice rooms. 8 hours a day, and they'd have to go check on you at midnight. So Steve's still there. So, you certainly left your mark.
I would say well after the school closed, because, what I had this room that they gave me in the very back of the school. Like, this was 1558 Hollywood Boulevard, like I said. So it had a view of looking out over LA and you could see over the freeway and everything right there. And I used to sit back there and practice. They gave me that room because I was doing some janitorial work for them, because I was broke. I didn't have any income at all or anything. In fact, Becky used to buy me a hamburger or coffee every day. So, but I did all the printouts for all the next day's lessons for everybody. I set up the rooms for whatever was going to be done, or if it was just a classroom or if it was going to be a live performance setting. I was the one that would set up everything, set up all the rooms for the classrooms the next day. And so that's kind of how I earned my keep there.
tricks of the trade, learning not just guitar, but also how to do multitask, which is what we're asked to do. The thing about at that time, how many students were there when you were in that class? Do you remember?
It was about 7, and then I think it was really only, it was like half of that actually graduated.
Okay.
That, yeah, so only about maybe 35 or 40 that actually graduated, so.
All right, Joe Diorio told me a story that one of the first seminars that Joe Pass did with Joe, this was at the old Gower Studios. There was, I think it was Les Wise and Ron Echte and Joe, and they were set up in different corners, and there must have been about 40 or 50 students. And Joe Pass looked out there and said, "Hey man, where are all these guys going to work?" And so, but with that, I mean, there's tenfold students now at these schools, but I think it's a good thing because the educational system allows guys to get together and share stuff, even if you don't become a professional player. I think it's encouraging for the fact that that interest is still there. And maybe you could talk about a little bit about how because you maneuvered into a certain direction, but maybe some guys that you knew who maybe did something else, but that time at GIT had an impact on them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I first got out of GIT, I was playing like in a fusion band, and then I played in a couple other bands too. There was at one point that I was playing 4 bands at once, and it was like the fusion band, and then there was like a real pop band, and then kind of a new wavy kind of thing, and then there was just another one that was just straight ahead rock and roll. But one thing that I was going to say also is that one of the best things from going to the Guitar Institute is that I learned to be an educator as well. And I wrote my books, The Right Touch, books 1, 2, and 3 there. But being an educator, that's another thing. Is just, I've done that a lot.
Yeah.
I've done that as much as I have played, basically, because I own a music school and everything. But it's always been just such a great, everything that I've learned there is always coming through still to this day, in my everyday life. And so, I'm really glad to have that opportunity, and I'm glad that the Guitar Institute where I went there, it was only jazz. Now, as you all know, it's a selection of different players. I was the only guy that had like bell-bottom pants, platform shoes, and a shag haircut, and a solid body guitar.
And most of the guys when I went there had 335s. Yeah, I had a 175. So I traded my Les Paul in when I was 17 at Norm's Rare Guitars. I got a 68 from Kalamazoo, and my Heritage that's made by the same guys. So
so Joe used to make fun of me all the time.
But he did, Joe had a great sense of humor.
That's the thing, that's one of the things I love most about him, is the fact that he always used to joke with us.
And a lot of the stuff that he developed, the intervallic stuff and all that, was a time period when he was in Florida at the Miami University teaching. And, he had students like Pat Metheny, and I'm going to be talking to Mark Egan as well. And so that was a very pinnacle point for him. How did you feel when you would take Joe's stuff? Did you feel like he transmitted it to you in a very direct way because he was trying to figure out how you thought, or did you feel like?
I think he kind of knew my background from what I had played previously. Like I said, I was already playing for years professionally, and so he knew that my use of the guitar was mainly based out of the pentatonic, major minor scales, and so. What he wanted to do is he wanted to show, like he would just take like an A minor pentatonic and go, play it like this. He'd play it going down, descending down in fifths. God, that sounds so completely different, And so when I wrote my first book, I had that in there, but it was two-handed, but both hands would be descending in fifths.
Right.
The patterns were at the same scale, and so that really got me to thinking. I think that he elevated me to a point and giving me a different perspective about everything. To the point where, even Steve Vai, I was doing a conversation interview with him once. This was, way back, probably 1985. And he says, what do you what are you thinking of when you're doing this part of the solo? Because I figured out the notes that you're playing, but I don't understand what you're thinking of. And I said, that's a Joe Diorio lick. And he goes, oh, okay. But I said, it's basically major six and major thirds
Right.
descending down in the A Mixolydian mode. And so then I heard him dinking around on his guitar, because it was just a phone conversation, right? And so I heard him dinking around on his guitar, and he goes, I see it. Yeah, okay, I get it, And so then we did a photo shoot together, just probably months after that. And then I was showing to him in person some other ideas that I basically got from Joe, and then incorporated two hands with it. And he said, "Oh man, I totally get what you're doing, And so then the next album we did, I heard a couple of things that I showed him that were really close, but his own,
His own take, yeah. Well, for me, the Intervallic Designs book, I took like one of the first ones. It may be the one that you used in that solo, and I developed the whole vocabulary out of that. And spending as much time as I did with Joe, I understood, how he would see intervals. And again, we actually talked, Tim Lurch and I talked about that intervals are not just, big skips, they can be half steps. But in the end, Joe understood that by breaking the chords up and looking at things like, he would always say, this is the chord, like Frozen, and then when you move it, that becomes liquid, which makes sense. So it's every guy plays an arpeggio, they'll start down at the lowest note and go to the highest note. But instead of doing that, Joe took the chord, how it was voiced in the intervals, whether it was fifths or thirds or fourths or whatever it was, and did it that way. And not just from the bottom up, but from the top down, which is something that most guys don't really think about. So Joe's concept was really ahead of its time. And there's so many great guitar players, but Joe Diorio in the early 70s, when he made those records in Florida on Spitball Records, that was far beyond anybody else that was doing anything at that time.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that we don't even know about were influenced by his early days, and people that have become more famous later on, but through listening to those recordings or taking lessons from them, he became kind of a pivotal point for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And their perspective of playing.
Yeah, well, Pat Metheny said once that, Bright Size Life, his first album, that he should give a royalty check to Joe Diorio, because that's classic Joe Diorio, the fifths, And it's true, everything you hear that Pat did when he was exploring intervals, it's all coming from Joe. It was interesting for me as a student and then later as a colleague to go on the road with him and then record with him, because when we were doing workshops together in Europe and concerts, and I would sit across from him and I'd see stuff that he showed me years ago, and then I would go like, oh yeah, the light bulb went off, and I went, now I understand. So did you have those light bulb moments with anything that you got from Joe?
Yeah, every time I sat down with him, or we were standing in the hall and having a conversation or whatever, he just showed me something, and I'd always have those little light bulb moments, because I'd think of what he was telling me, and then I'd think, okay, how can I incorporate that into my style, and how can I incorporate it two-handed.
Right.
So while I figured out the pattern with just my left hand, then I think, okay, now how can I add this on and possibly play it in some type of a sequence with my right hand on top of it,
Right.
I was always thinking like that every time he was showing me something new, and just watching him play too. I used to, what was that? Was it $2 bills out there in the valley?
Yeah, Dante's.
Yeah, right. There was a few different clubs.
Carmelo's, yeah. Joe played all those places. In fact, I'd go with a little tape recorder. I'd tape all the gigs. Do you know where Joe got the concept to do that? There was a book, Slaminsky. He wrote this thing where he took intervals from a 12-tone scale and just started doing them in different octaves.
You mean from a mathematical perspective?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's music involved in it too, because when you do that, you're going to hear, it's like Bach, you hear how stuff works. So Slaminsky was the hip book, and Joe told me that in Chicago when he was playing with Eddie Harris and Sonny Stitt, that was the book to get. So he bought it, and he opened it up, and he said he couldn't make heads or tails out of it. It was like, what do I do with this? So he put it on his shelf, and he said one night he was going to a gig, and before he went to the gig, He reached up to the book, he opened up one of those examples or exercises, and he looked at it, and he understood how he could use it on the gig because he heard how it functioned. Like you were saying, that's the chord. Okay, I can use this on this. And that opened up the world for him to go explore what he did. So
that's interesting. I had no idea about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, and the thing is Joe really took it far beyond, because even Pino and I were talking about that. If you took Joe's solos and you transpose it onto saxophone or onto flute or piano, it'd be incredible, because he just had this incredible melodic and harmonic sense that was far beyond anybody else.
For sure. And the thing is, the way it was split up, I became mesmerized when I watched him play, because I could hear the melody, and the whole underlying theme of what he was playing.
Right.
There was all this bombarding air traffic happening all around it.
Yeah.
That was just like picking these notes out and going, it's so bizarre because all this makes sense. It sounds so random.
Yeah.
It all makes perfect sense.
Well, he was able to take the harmony and pull it in and out. And in fact, there's an interview with Joe, one of the last ones he did for the Jocko movie. It didn't make it into the final cut, but it's in the extras, and he's talking about bebop, and he's talking about how that developed, that vocabulary, but how he sees it and how he saw taking the harmony and just pulling it out a little bit and bringing it back in the center. It's interesting, but the thing about Joe is that he could play so melodically. I don't know if you've listened to any of the Color of Sound, but there's 2 tracks on there. The first one is called How Old Are You? And the second one's called How Old Do I Look? And that was our conversation when I met him.
Right, yeah, you said that to me.
Yeah, but when you listen to those, we're playing all free, but it's hard to differentiate myself and Joe because there's so much stuff happening that it's interwoven. And even when Joe would listen to it, he didn't know which one was me and which one was him.
There was times in there where it was a bit confusing, I'll have to tell you. But what a cool piece,
we just started to play, and then I did one where I take a card and I put it in my strings, and because of the pH, so I get a drum sound like a tabla.
Yeah.
And we did an improvised piece. It's called Dance of the Inner Valley.
Oh, wow.
And Joe's playing all that classic, intervallic design stuff over the top. Yeah.
That's perfect because
intervallic,
yes.
Valley. Yes. Yeah. And then we did. I wrote a ballad, or two, and some stuff on there. But it really was to be able to get, at least from my perspective, Joe's whole thing of what he was about, and for us to just have a conversation musically. We had 2 days in the studio, and Joe's recordings sometimes were not sonically the best, so I tried to get a great sound with having him plug direct, and also I had this Holland amp that he played through, and that helped a great deal. But we just it was one of those weekends where we just had this synergy, and Joe loved the record. And he had his stroke right as the release came out. It was May of 2005, but he used to listen to that record every day. And in fact, he loved that record so much that I'm so pleased that we got because I'd given up on the idea of recording with Joe Diorio a long time ago. And it presented itself at the right time. And I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. His legacy will live on. He's one of those that he may not be popular in mainstream, but then it's kind of like Alan Holdsworth in a way that he's not known, like an Eddie Van Halen or something.
Right.
But his reach is so far and worldwide. It reaches so many different genres. He was the last one that I listened to be influenced by when I was going to the guitar student technology in 1978. The albums, UK was out. He was playing with Tony Levin and Bill Bruford and all that. And then he also put out in '78 the Enigmatic Ocean with Sean McCall.
Yeah.
And so I was listening to those two, and I was trying to figure out all this stuff that Holdsworth was playing on there. And his approach was just like, like nothing like Joe's. It was just like nothing you'd ever heard before.
Well, any guitar player that you would talk to knew Joe Diorio. Whether it was a rock guy, a jazz guy, they all knew.
Right, exactly.
And the new generation, I have a student from Vietnam who's studying now at the jazz school in Berkeley. He came to me online and said, "I'd love to study with you. I'm a big fan of you and Joe Diorio." So, and he knows, all that stuff. So the legacy lives on, and Joe's popularity has grown immensely, but his influence is there for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so cool. I'm so glad to hear that it's so far-reaching too.
Yeah, I mean, and but you and like Jennifer are testaments to the fact that what he was doing back then had an influence on a completely different genre, what people would think of, because most people would think, well, bebop and jazz, but Joe wasn't really about just that, because he loved Indian music, and he loved Ravi Shankar more. When Wes Montgomery died, he told me that for him, that was the end of jazz guitar, and he thought, what am I going to do to Wes did everything you could possibly do. So his mission was to basically come up with a vocabulary that hadn't been done yet, and to put it into a context where it wasn't just playing standards and that kind of thing. And I think he achieved that for sure. And that's really, I think, his legacy. Sets him aside from the other music. I mean, there's great guitar players, Joe Pass and Kenny Burrell and all those guys, but I don't think they ever pushed the envelope harmonically and melodically like Joe Diorio did.
You know what I like to hear, David, is I like to hear guitarists and other musicians, of course, come up with something that's just totally unique. It's totally their own thing. There's all these guys that can play like Yngwie and everything, a million miles an hour and all that. But when somebody comes up and they play something very different, and they're not just a clone of something that's already been done, then that's what I listen to. And I'm hearing some younger guys come up with some stuff now that are actually really good players. And you can tell they know that they know their theory. Now, you know as well as I do, you go in and you listen to somebody, it might just be some band that's playing in the background, but you know when the guitarist knows his theory.
Yeah.
You know it right away. Because there's that other element there, where they're not just playing the basics, they're throwing their own little flair in from the knowledge that they have.
Right. Well, Joe was all about, learn as much as you can and then don't think about it.
I remember Tony Tedesco used to say that too. He said, learn everything and then forget about it.
Yeah.
Like Dramatic.
Right. Yeah, Tommy, we could talk about Tommy forever. He was great. So when you were there at GIT, who were the main instructors besides Joe?
Well, it was like the ones that you mentioned. It was Les Wise. It was, Don Mock, of course. It was Ron Eschte. Who else was there? I remember Ron Eschte. He was really good with the chords, man. His chord soloing, I just remember that.
Is amazing. Yeah, Ronnie was incredible. In fact, sometimes he'd make jokes when he would play with Joe. He'd go, "Hey Joe, when I'm soloing, man, let me cover the chords."
That's funny. But yeah, and then Howard Roberts was involved, but he was more involved with writing actually.
Jamie Finley. Did you know Jamie?
Oh yeah. Jamie's, I think he's still down in is he up in Seattle?
Yeah, he's in Seattle.
You know what's really cool is that that time era, the late 70s into the early 80s, like when you were in 1980, there was like a camaraderie of students, and I don't know if it's that way now, but it was really tight back then. Everybody kind of stayed in touch, or at least they got in touch later on with popularity of the internet and everything, and social media. But it was so cool to think back. I still think often about what it was like, going to the school and hitting up Joe for different licks and stuff, and just the feeling that you had there. You didn't know what was going to happen. Everybody was just like, who knows what's next?
Yep.
But they were there for a purpose, and that purpose was important. And everybody joined in on that camaraderie of let's just get as good as we can.
Well, that was the thing too, is that the environment was great, like you said, because you were surrounded by other guitar players that, were basically trying to do the same thing you were, is learn as much as they could, share ideas and play and absorb all this stuff from these great guys. And I almost went to Berkeley, and that was because when I was a teenager, I played trumpet in the junior high. and I was really good. So my music teacher said, you should think about Berklee College of Music. And then I took guitar up, and I'll never forget, he called me to sit in a big band once, and I played, and he came to me and he said, David, when I heard you quit the trumpet, I was disappointed, but when I heard you play guitar, I knew why. So that was a great compliment. So he wrote me a recommendation for Berklee, and I was all set. I graduated high school in 1979, and I was all set to go. And then I met a guy at a music store who said, man, don't go to Berklee, go to GIT. And I'm like, what's GIT? And then he told me about it. And then my brother was playing with a guy who, did you know Craig Charmont by chance?
Of course, yeah. He's still out there playing, man. Craig's a great guy.
Yeah. So Craig he said to me, he said, no, don't go to Berklee, go to GIT. I said, what's GIT? So I went down to visit the school, and I met Becky, and I think I met Carmi, and took a tour, and I was like, that's where I'm going to go. And yeah.
Great people, very welcoming atmosphere and everything. And one thing that it really, the school really taught me, and I don't talk about this candidly very often, but it's the fact that it wasn't about being, becoming popular, like becoming a rock star or anything like that. It was nothing about that. It was just about music, learning, that learning atmosphere. And I love that. And I think that, a lot of people that I met, later on throughout my rock and roll travels and stuff, it's just, they didn't quite get that when I tried to explain it to them. It's not about the band or anything like that. It's about the music. This is what it's really about. This is the crux of the whole thing. It's the music. And some of them got it, but I think that a lot of them kind of missed that. They were more concerned about selling records,
right,
becoming hugely popular and everything, and the music itself.
Joe Diorio told me the best piece of advice when I was 18. He said, David, don't go for the money, go for the music. Because if you really believe in the music, the money will come. And I followed that all along. I mean, success is a funny thing. I always tell people that success is not defined by how many records you sell or how many albums you have on your wall. It's completion. If you're going to start to do something like write a song or learn a solo or do a gig, do it. Each time you complete that step, and that's basically what happens when you go to a school, is there's tasks that you do to complete to move on to the next thing. Everything else is out of your hands, because as well as I do, you can sell 2 million albums and somebody would say that's a flop because the previous record sold 10 million. And you kind of go like, well, that doesn't make any sense, So it's about really just completing the cycle of what you're trying to do and move forward. And Joe was all about that too. Even after the stroke, he was learning music and writing music and working on things. I told a story, I believe it was with Pino, that after the stroke, I visited Joe a couple of times. And the one time I got him to pick up the guitar, he could barely move because the therapist said, put your hand on the guitar. It's good therapy, just to hold it. And so I went to his apartment and I brought my guitar. I said, Joe, come on, let's play. He said, no, David, play for me. And I went, no, come on, I want you to play. So he picked up his 175. His hand could barely move, but every note was Joe Diorio. It had that sound, that feel, that thing. And then you realize, you go like, it's not the piece of wood, it's the guy.
Exactly. It's how you interpret it, how you share your thought through that.
And Joe was very communicative, even though some people would say that some of the things he might have done may not have resonated. I've seen it that people that were not musically inclined would be able to gravitate towards Joe because he just had this thing that when he played, he was very direct. His personality came out in a big, huge way. And I think that's probably why he was so charismatic, because he carried so much spiritual stuff with him, which is more important than the financial gains and the fame and all that stuff, I think.
Absolutely. It's one of those things where it's something that you carry inside, and it's something that other people really appreciate as well. That what you've given, as far as a musician to others, what it makes them feel like when you're playing it. That's so much more important than how many records you sell.
Absolutely. Well, the career path. I mean, you had your career path I had mine. There's no formula for that. But what I've learned is that, when you're preparing yourself, if you do complete the tasks, then opportunity comes at the right time and you're prepared to do it. Because a lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm not ready," or "I don't know," and then that hesitation is what I think stops or impedes people from going forward. And Joe always told me, he said, "David, I was doing this all the time and I was hesitating, but if you just keep going with that attitude, things will happen." And, I was one of the first guys, I think, to get a major record deal as a jazz guy out of GIT. And that, I never anticipated that in my wildest dreams. I was like, I'll find a little boutique label in Europe and they'll make, and then I get proposed with the opportunity to record for MCA Records. And not just me, but I mean, on the same label, they had Larry Carlton, they had Michael Brecker, Jack DeJohnette, the Yellow Jackets, Spyro Gyra. So it was this thing where and I was like 22 or 23 years old. So it was, having had the experience that I went through at the school, I think really prepared me just to go and not have any hesitation about saying, yes, I can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people that you mentioned there, like, it's Lee Ritenour too, and of course Robin Ford, and even like of course you said Larry Carlton, and the list goes on and on. They're kind of these fusion players, and I love listening to these guys because it wasn't just superb playing, but it was just so melodic that how they interwove stuff. They'd play this melodic piece that was right in scale, and then they would go a little bit outside, and then the way they brought it back in, I just kind of, God, that was so brilliant, to the point where, then I'd listen to rock guitar solos, like it's really bored. And so I think that's why when I did Toronto Radio, I want to do something completely different here, and that's what I thought, I'm going to start off not on a root or a fifth note.
Right. When was the first time you heard Joe play? Do you remember?
Well, it was probably just a couple days after I started there back in March 20th of 1978, and it was kind of like an orientation thing that they were all playing at. It's when everybody got in, and all the students were here, I'm saying, and then he played, and I was just like, I wanted to quit. I'm just I'm not ever going to be able to play that stuff, and I still don't think I could. I don't know, but I just took everything, that I learned from him and the other teachers and everything, but it blew me away because I didn't know things like that were possible on guitar. And that was such an incredible journey because it brought me into this whole different realm because, growing up listening to, basically, the typical Beckers, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and everything, it's all brilliant stuff.
Sure.
But then you hear this other stuff and it's a completely different direction. And you go, oh my God. And it's one of those things too. I remember talking with Steve Lynch when we did that video shoot, and we were talking about some of these jazz guitars. And I was saying, just when you think you're getting good, listen to one of these guys, and you go, oh man, I got a long ways to go. And he said, yeah, he says it's so much more complex than what we can even imagine, because it goes way out there. And so we definitely agree on that. It's you think that you've gotten really good to a certain point, and you are good, but then you listen to these guys that just immerse themselves in nothing but playing jazz and just really dedicating everything about themselves into this instrument, and they journey beyond the confines of the usual territories they were touring, and it's something that it just really catches you off guard, and it really, you never forget it.
Well, that was Joe. I mean, Joe was able to get in the zone, as we called it, where he would just go far beyond anything.
There, and he'd have his eyes closed, and I'd just be watching. I'm just thinking, how can he do this like this? And his fingers were just jumping all over, and he was just like his eyes closed. He was super tense, you know, it's his whole forehead was
Yep.
breaking up in concentration, and it was coming from almost like a different place. It was magical, you know, and you just go, my God, where does that come from?
Yeah. Well, his artistic endeavors went far beyond music because he was painting and drawing.
Yeah,
In fact, the behind me is the cover of The Color of Sound, and that's a play on The Sound of Color, which is a Kandinsky uh, painting, and that was Joe's favorite painter, is Kandinsky. So just about, I think it was a couple of months before we did the record, I was living in Germany, and at the town that I lived in, they had an exhibit of Kandinsky, and I bought this huge book for Joe of his works, and I brought it to him as a gift, and I knew that meant a lot to him. So when we were going to do the record, I thought, what better title could we have than The Color of Sound?
yeah, absolutely.
And the guy that did the cover is an artist in Germany, Manfred Pollard. And I told him right away, I said Kandinsky, and he went, "Oh, I know what to do." And so
Yeah, I love that title, "The Color of Sound." That's really befitting.
yeah, the title track was a tune that I wrote with Joe in mind, playing a very melodic kind of melody. And when he played it, it was exactly like I imagined it to be. And I put some pads in the background, some orchestral pads, and it's a very somber piece, but it really reflects that side of Joe Diorio, which a lot of people are not aware of. And yeah, and there's some other things we did too that reflect that. But Joe just had, so much spirituality that just seeing him in a room, he would light up the room.
You know, and that's one of the things also that you just reminded me of. Joe and I got into some of his spiritual beliefs, and we were on that same kind of a path, you know what I mean, where we're looking outside of the norm, and I really like that. Howard Roberts was like that as well.
Yeah.
And so I just remember that, and he influenced me more in that direction because of the fact that he was just so open. He had his own version of what everything was all about, but he was also still like a sponge.
Yes.
Our conversations would get really deep, and I really enjoyed that about it. It was just like one of those things where you just go, okay, this is more than just a musician. This is a guy that really, and I think this is important. Somebody that really, kind of like on an intellectual scale, where they're kind of carving their own path. They're not followers.
No, Joe was definitely somebody who was a trendsetter. He certainly was ahead of his time. And Joe had an interesting life too as a musician, as a person. But the thing about Joe, he was very durable, if that makes sense. He had that stocky build, and even with the hardest of health issues, he managed to always bounce back in a way where other guys would have been written off a long time ago. And even when he was fairly healthy and we were touring together in Europe or doing stuff, he was a trooper, man. He didn't let anything phase him because he'd been through so much as a kid growing up in Waterbury and then, in the Chicago scene and all that. He told me a funny story once. He was playing a gig. I don't even know where it was, but playing with a trio or something, and he said that all of a sudden the guy in the back of the club started to yell, "Stop the music!" And Joe just kept playing, because he ignored it. And then the guy got really close to his face, and he said, "When I could smell the garlic on his breath, I took my fist and I just did this, and I knocked him out." And then he realized that the guy that he knocked out was the club owner. And so he said he pulled his amp, threw it in the car with his guitar, not even in the case, and drove off. So, there are the two sides of Joe Diorio, that spiritual, esoteric side, and
But you got to stand up for what's right too.
Absolutely.
Stand your ground. I mean, it's Joe's not the type of person, of course, as you very well know. Where he's very jovial and he's very.
Right.
That's a good way to be. Be reserved, but use your arsenal when it's needed.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, I know that side of Joe Diorio that you don't want to get on the other side of, and I never did. And for good reason. But he was a very peaceful man as well. He had those two sides. I think it may have been the time that he was drinking, and he gave that up because it just wasn't working for him. So obviously that was a call to that. But he had some funny stories, so we had a lot of laughs. But. Well, man, this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And
No, it's been a real pleasure.